Okay, thank you all for joining me for this session. It was on the schedule. It was entitled Best Privacy Books, but actually this is better titled Notable Privacy Books, because I'm going to not just single out my absolute favorites, but try to talk about books that I think are notable, interesting for various reasons, and really do a kind of tour through history. A journey through history starting in the 1960s and going all the way to the present. I'd like to highlight many privacy books along the way and why they're significant and worth reading, worth thinking about, and still relevant today, including the old ones. I have collected a lot of privacy books. This is just part of my privacy library. All these books, practically every one you see on the shelves are privacy books. I collect them, and I just cannot stop collecting books. It's just an addiction of mine. So I'd like to start with some of the early privacy books and start from in the 1960s. So we're really going back in time. And some of these early books were popular books about privacy. Here, the first one is this book by Myron Brenton, The Privacy Invaders, a book from 1964, which is just a popular account of ways that privacy is being invaded. I think it's very interesting historically to see what people were concerned about circa 1964, which is very different than what the privacy concerns are today, although actually it's surprising how much stays the same in a way. It's about gathering and using data. Vance Packard wrote a few books. He was a writer of popular books. He wrote a number of books, and he actually wrote two books about privacy. One from 1965, The Naked Society, and this talked about surveillance technologies. And then he also wrote a book called The Hidden Persuaders in 1967, which was a kind of an account of manipulation. Manipulation techniques that were being used by companies back in this age. Now, this is long before the age of dark patterns and the manipulation we hear about today, but it's been a long-standing problem. And that's one thing I find very interesting about privacy is a lot of the things we talk about today, we use different terms. I mean, we think, oh my gosh, it's such a big problem. It's so new. But in fact, it's not new. We're just using different terms to describe things that were going on long before. But now the technology has put onto steroids. Privacy and Freedom. This is a very, very famous book. And I will say, too, that I have some books from the EU here as well, but I would say this list is somewhat biased toward books in English that I was able to find and track down in the United States. So it is a little skewed, although so there's probably some books I'm missing that were published here, published in different languages, published elsewhere in the world. I'm just never got my hands on those books. So Weston's book was actually had a very big influence on U.S. privacy law, and I think even privacy law beyond the United States. Weston, there was a time when I kept reading about Weston's book. When I started researching privacy in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I've got to get this book. I've got to have my own copy. And it was out of print. So I actually had to buy it used. And there were only a few copies around. But now a new edition has been published. I actually I was honored to be able to write the preface to the book, this new edition in 2015. So it's great this book is back in print. Weston makes this book, I think, there's a lot of the book that's not relevant today. He talks about things, but there's a part that I think really stands out to me where he starts to talk about the values and types of privacy, what is privacy, and he goes into a very lengthy sociological discussion using Irving Goffman, who had a theory that we play different roles in life, we wear different masks in life, and that's a very important aspect of living is that we have these different roles, and privacy preserves these roles and protects these roles. And they're important. So we act differently with colleagues than we would to our parents, than we would to our children, and so on. And I think it's a really great discussion. He has a great discussion of the value of privacy. So I definitely would recommend this book, even though it is very old. It did have a very important influence, especially on U.S. policy. Okay. So let's move now to the 1970s. And we still have some early books on privacy that I think are pretty notable. Arthur Miller wrote a book called The Assault on Privacy, and he was a law professor who wrote on a number of different topics, and I don't think he's written much else on privacy except for this book in 1972 on privacy. And he talks a lot about the threats to privacy by the growing collection and use of personal data. I think his warnings are very prescient. James Rule has published many privacy books. I have a number of his books on this list. It's remarkable just how far back he goes. And he's still writing privacy books to this day. He still has them. So he's a privacy all-star, really. And this book from 1973 looks at various types of systematic gathering and use of personal data. He explores credit reporting systems, police surveillance, driver licensing, and insurance. And he looks at both Britain and the United States. And so I think it's a really interesting early account of these things. This is actually technically not a book. This is a report, but it was published as a book, so I'm taking the liberty to include it. It's the report Records, Computers, and the Rights of Citizens from 1973, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. This is really famous because it is the articulation in the United States of the Fair Information Practice Principles, otherwise known as the FIPS. There was also a report from the UK that had recommended things that were similar in nature. We've seen the FIPS have a tremendously important role in privacy law. They formed the backbone of the OECD guidelines in 1980. They also were widely used in the EU Data Protection Directive, and then the GDPR, which is very much a successor to the directive. You see the Fair Information Practice Principles in various privacy laws. These are principles such as data minimization, protecting data security, transparency, providing individual rights to access and correct their information, data quality, and so on. And they have their origins here. You have a pretty narrow set of FIPS in this report. The OECD guidelines expanded it to 8 principles. I think now they have 13, but the 1980 version had, I think, 8. And so this really, I think, had a very, very big impact on, actually the law it had the biggest impact on was this was right before the Privacy Act in the United States, an act that regulates government collection and use of personal data, an act that pretty much has been systematically violated by Doge and Elon Musk. But that is the act that regulates and restricts and protects government collection of data and use of data from individuals. And then all the other privacy laws, you can find FIPS in those laws. This is a very influential document. This book is interesting. I got my hands on this book from 1977. It's a kind of interesting mix of anthropology, philosophy, and psychology. Schneider argues that essentially we shouldn't try to eradicate shame. The way to help protect our lives against the harmful effects of shame is privacy. So that's why privacy is relevant here. I think it was a very interesting read and a thoughtful account of privacy in its earlier days. So let's go to the 80s, and one thing you also see is that as we go each decade, there are more and more privacy books being published. So what happened in the 80s? Here we have another book by James Rule. This is a kind of really interesting little book. It has summaries of very important privacy books and reports from the 1960s and 70s. So some of the things I discussed with you already, this book has like a 2-page summary of them and a discussion. So it's actually really interesting because it kind of walks through some of the key documents, some of the key books, some of the key literature from the 60s and 70s. So I find this book interesting. It's interesting, like what were people thinking about this in 1980? Shomans is the editor of this book, Philosophical Dimensions of Privacy. This is actually a collection of essays on the meaning and value of privacy. And it's really interesting. I relied a lot on these essays when I wrote some of my early work on how to think about privacy. And so I wrote a number of articles. I wrote Conceptualizing Privacy, a taxonomy of privacy, and ultimately a book called Understanding Privacy. And I would say that a lot of the essays about understanding privacy I was responding to in Understanding Privacy were from this book. So I think they're really interesting philosophical accounts of what privacy is and what the thinking of, and I haven't seen many other books do something like this. So I think it's still a very valuable, almost timeless collection of works that I would definitely recommend to have on your shelf if you're interested in thinking through what privacy is. Another really interesting book on privacy is An Easy Access. This is by Anita Allen, a law professor in the United States who also has a PhD in philosophy. And this book primarily focuses on privacy and women, but it has also a very sophisticated theoretical and philosophical account of privacy. I think it's a very important and valuable book and very well ahead of its time. So we also have this book, actually it's out of order. Well, no, it's not out of order. From David Flaherty, Protecting Privacy in Surveillance Societies. This is an early book looking at a comparative account of privacy. And so he looks at privacy in different countries, and he compares the law in several different countries. And I think it's very interesting to see what things were back in the late 80s. So let's go to the 90s, and we'll see some more here. Regulating privacy. I love this book. This is by Colin Bennett, and what he argues in the book, the gist of the argument, is that data protection in the EU and the US are converging. This is interesting that he saw this in 1992, and I think we're seeing this even more today. So his thesis was we're seeing this convergence, not a divergence. And we always have talk about how like the gulf between the United States and the EU is unbridgeable, and we're so different in privacy that it's impossible for us to reconcile our approaches. In particular, there was an article by James Whitman, and it got a lot of traction in the United States, that said that the US and the EU are totally different in their privacy cultures, and they're just incompatible with each other, and really can't really come together in any way. They're always going to clash. And I actually think Bennett's theory is more interesting and more correct, in that there's a lot of concepts that are in fact being adopted by both the US and the EU. The US is adopting EU concepts, and EU is adopting US concepts. And a lot of the evidence that to kind of prove his thesis is what we see recently. You look at the new U.S. state privacy laws, and you'll see that a lot of those laws are using sensitive data, EU definitions of personal data. They're using a lot of concepts from the GDPR are finding their way into those laws. Now, those laws are still a far cry from the GDPR, but we definitely are starting to see some aspects of the GDPR find their way into U.S. law. A right to delete. And the interesting thing is that I remember how in not too long before the state laws, where things in the EU, in the GDPR were considered a non-starter in the US. Like someone would say, the right to delete in 2016 in the United States. No way, absolutely out of the question. Recognizing an EU-style definition of personal data that recognizes not just identified data, but also identifiable data. No way would the US ever do something like that. Sensitive data, no way. And I can go down a list of things that were non-starters in the United States that now are not even controversial. They're not even debatable. Every law has it now. So it's very interesting how a lot of things that were at once considered almost impossible for U.S. law have been embraced by U.S. law. And we have data breach notification, which is originates in the United States, which now is spread to the GDPR. And so we had California, and now all 50 states have a breach notification law. GDPR said, we kind of like this from the U.S., but of course, that would be kind of embarrassing for the EU to actually say there's something good about this. We have to change it. We'll make it really short. We'll have to make it 72 hours to have to make it a little better than the U.S. But they did take that thing from the U.S. So there is sharing, and the laws are converging. They're getting closer together rather than farther apart. So I think Colin Bennett's theory is very apt. This is a really interesting book, and I actually use this a lot in some of my early work in privacy. Eric Larson's The Naked Consumer, and he talks about all the techniques that data brokers were using to track consumers and how they were selling lists of consumers and their interests all the way back in 1992. And I found this very, very helpful because when I started writing about this, it was in the early days of the internet, and so now it seems like, oh my gosh, there's so much tracking going on. But there was a lot of tracking pre-internet, and so this creates a great picture of how data is being gathered and tracked and what data brokers were doing in this early time. And I still think it's helpful and interesting historically to take a look at that book. The Panoptic Sort by Oscar Gandy. This is a real classic. It's well ahead of its time. This was published in 1993. Gandy focused a lot on the use of technology to identify and categorize people. And he talked about issues such as discrimination and bias. He talked about power. He talked about a lot of the key themes that are very relevant in privacy and data protection scholarship today. And he discussed this long before many were talking about these issues. So I definitely recommend his book. I think it's very relevant today. And I think to show the relevance of it, a new edition was published just a few years ago, in fact. So you can get your hands on this book now. Before, it was actually really hard to get your hands on a copy. I couldn't get an original copy of this when I tried way back when to get it. Now you might be able to, but it was hard when I had made my attempt to get this book. Next one is Jeff Smith's Managing Privacy. This was a book that was interesting because it talked about corporate policies regarding privacy and their programs in '94. And this is long before we've really have chief privacy officers, long before we have the modern regime of privacy programs or data protection programs. And what's interesting about this is less like, historically it's interesting just what did these programs look like, what were companies doing, which I think is really fascinating. But the thing that I take away that I think is relevant today was he showed that companies that had established policies, that had thought through this and built up some kind of a program, they tended to drift over time. And he showed how these would break down and things would fail and why they would fail. And I think it's very interesting to look at this because I think a lot of this happens today. And so you can learn a lot. And I haven't seen a similar study done today looking at what kind of breaks down in quite the way that he did in this book. So I think it's a really interesting study of kind of the inner workings of companies and what kind of why things go astray and how we get violations and how things that were established become lazier and lazier over time. Priscilla Regan's Legislating Privacy is a fascinating book. It talks about the making of a lot of the sectoral U.S. federal privacy laws. And what I found really interesting about this one is that first, it goes through the legislative history of how these laws were made, and it's very interesting, the compromises that were made and the decisions that were made in the laws, like what the various bills looked like, and then how they got changed and how they got weakened by industry lobbying. So it's a great picture on the legislative process in the United States, which is kind of rather ugly. But it's very illuminating for how these laws came to be the way they are. She also has a great discussion of a larger point that I think is very relevant today, which is that one reason why privacy laws were weaker than they should have been is that privacy was viewed and conceptualized as an individual interest, as something protecting the individual, as a source in individual rights. And I think the big difference in the EU is that privacy is seen as like a fundamental individual right, but it's still very much individual, the person, the data subject. But the views on the other side that the lobbyists were presented in terms of societal views, like efficient commercial transactions and free speech, values that are understood much more beyond the individual as important to society. And her argument was that privacy would fare a lot better if we reframed some of these arguments a little less around the individual and more about the contribution of privacy to larger social aims. The way free speech is. Free speech is an individual right, but the way it's framed in debates and discussions transcend the individual and talk about collective values and collective, the implications of free speech for democracy. They transcend particular individual cases, and that kind of way of framing and thinking and talking and justifying the value of privacy is incredibly important because it can make privacy have a greater impact when balanced against interests that are defined in this kind of broader way. And I think that this point is really important. She was one of the early ones to make it. A lot of scholars since then have made points like this, including myself and many others have taken her point and developed it because I think it's a really valuable argument. We also have a history of the private life. This is a book series. It's actually 5 books. It's a really fascinating account of private life from antiquity to the present. So each volume covers a certain time period in history. These books are just really interesting to learn like how people perceived what was private and what was not private in different periods of time. And it shows that attitudes about privacy have changed, practices have changed. There's a lot of historical and cultural contingency for what we consider to be private and what we consider to be public. So I find these books really fascinating. Judith Dessou's In Pursuit of Privacy is a great philosophical account of privacy. There weren't a lot of books on the philosophy of privacy that were written in the earlier days. There's a lot more now. This one in particular, there was Anita Allen's that I talked about earlier. There's the Showman set of essays on philosophical dimensions. I think this is a very smart book. It's really well written and thoughtful, and I definitely recommend it. It's often, I haven't seen it discussed a lot. It kind of got, it just seems to have not really been played a big role in the scholarship that I've read, but I think it's worth reading. So let's go to 2000, and we really start seeing a ton of books after 2000. So this is just the prelude. There's a lot more to come. So let's start Simpson Garfinkel's Database Nation. This was a great book, one of the early books that I read as I started to look at what the current threats to privacy were. This is less of a policy book and more of a what's going on the ground book, and he talks about a lot of concrete examples of data collection and abuse of data and other things. It's a really interesting read, and it's interesting, I think, historically to see what were the big concerns at the turn of the century. John Gilliam's Overseers of the Poor is a really interesting sociological account of the massive surveillance on poor people in the United States. And in particular, he looked at people who were on welfare and the surveillance that they were forced to endure to get welfare benefits. And he also has a lot of interviews with people talking about the effects of surveillance in their own voice. And it's very interesting how lay people discuss why surveillance is harming them, why they find it troubling, what they think about it. I think it's a really interesting account of what's going on, and especially hearing from the people themselves, not just the academics saying this is why it's harmful, but why people think it's harmful. This book is by me. I think I should include my own stuff too. This was the first book I wrote about privacy in 2004. And what I talked about was, used the term digital dossiers to describe the aggregation of data about individuals into large files that were then used to analyze and make judgments about individuals. I also compared metaphors for how do we describe what's going on with privacy today. And one thing I saw was that a lot of people were talking about privacy in terms of Big Brother. It's Big Brother, and Big Brother is being used for everything, not just government, but also for the private sector gathering of data. And I thought that Big Brother was maybe a little overused there, and that a different metaphor captured what was going on with private sector collection and use of data. The metaphor I proposed as an alternative way of thinking about this was Kafka's The Trial. The Trial is about this guy who suddenly finds himself under arrest, but he's not told why. And he spends the rest of the novel trying to figure out what's going on. And he finds out that there's this dossier about him, but that he has no ability to access it, no ability to find out what's in it, no ability to challenge it. Things just happen to him. His information's used by this court system, which is kind of vague, unclear what exactly it is type of body to make judgments about him. And I think this is what's going on with privacy these days, is that we have this data, it's being used kind of in secret in this clandestine way where we have no idea what exactly is going on, but it's affecting us. And we're helpless and vulnerable to do anything about it. And I think that captures what's going on with the current system of privacy in the modern age with especially the private sector. With the government, I still think Orwell's metaphor is very apt. It captures a lot about what the government does and a lot of privacy, but it's not the only thing of what's going wrong. Bruce Schneier's Secrets and Lies is a great book on data security. I really like Bruce Schneier's writing. He is a technologist, but he writes in a very accessible way. What he says is incredibly thoughtful and wise. He's written a number of books. I have another one on this list. Every book I find very insightful. I learn a lot from what I read from him. He really has a very rich understanding, and he's great at making things accessible for folks without a technological background. Robert O'Hara was one of the early journalists to focus heavily on privacy. And when I started writing on privacy, his work was pretty much about like 80% of the articles that were about privacy were articles by Robert O'Hara. He recently passed away, unfortunately. But he, I don't think there were many other reporters on the privacy beat like he was. And he wrote for the Washington Post. And he wrote constantly about private sector data gathering, government surveillance, and the relationship between the two. And he ultimately pulled his work together into this book, No Place to Hide. And so I think it's very interesting to see, this journalistic perspective on what was happening with privacy from the turn of the century and late 90s, early 2000s. So I think it's really great work. It was incredibly important work to learn what was going on the ground from O'Hara. I can't tell you how much I relied on his reporting in my work on sort of what was happening. And he really understood privacy incredibly well. It was a joy to talk to him as a journalist because he really knew what was going on. He knew the issues. He really knew it well, because a lot of times I'll talk to journalists, they have no idea, and I have to give them like a mini course and they still don't understand what's happening. He actually really knew what he was writing about. There's this book, another one of mine. This is The Future of Reputation. I tried to tackle social media. When I wrote this, Facebook was not the leading social media site. It was a small site, and the big one was MySpace. And then there was Friendster, I think, and there are others, but a lot of the players changed. And I issued a warning in the book, like there's a lot of problems with the social media. It's going to cause a lot of damage to society. And it looks like people listened to me. No one listened, and here we are. I think social media, I wanted to explore the really challenging issues that it raised, that there are just a lot of privacy challenges to all the data that's being gathered. People are encouraged to share so much that they probably shouldn't be sharing. All sorts of gossip and rumor running rampant. Today, there's a lot of, interestingly, all sorts of different terms for what's going on in different sites. I still think the underlying issues are there, but definitely the landscape has changed dramatically since this book was written. It's almost going to be 20 years. James Rule, again, a great book, Privacy in Peril. This book has kind of both a theoretical and practical analysis of privacy issues. All his books do. He, I think, might have the record for writing books in the most decades, because he goes back to the 70s. But I think he has books in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. It goes... and there's some others that could maybe rival that. Paul Schwartz has some articles, but not the number of books. And since we're focused on books, I I think rule might be the winner. Lawrence Friedman's book, Guarding Life's Dark Secrets, this is a great, really interesting book about the development of privacy norms and reputation during the 19th century. And what he examines is what he calls the Victorian compromise, which is that in these times, especially the late 19th century, there are these views about public propriety, and everyone had to, kind of be very buttoned up, but in their private lives, people would kind of let loose. And the Victorian compromise was that, people's private lives would be kind of strictly protected and kept private, and the law would kind of back people up in protecting their private lives, including doing things that, if in public, would be, in fact, considered, very, very taboo. So an example would be, gay sex was, a capital offense during these times. And a lot of times there would be blackmail going on, but people could go to the authorities, tell them about the blackmail, which ultimately would, in fact, tell them that, in fact, that, they were engaged in conduct that would ordinarily could be a capital crime, and basically the police would say, we're going to go after the blackmail. We're going to protect you. We're going to ignore whether this is true or false, and help protect you. And this was sort of part of this Victorian compromise, where we'll allow the conduct, just keep it quiet. Keep it in the background. We'll keep it in secret, and we'll protect. Now, a lot of this protection wasn't always fair. It wasn't always, this was really protecting wealthy people who would get the protection of the police with blackmail, and so it was sort of lopsided. But it's very interesting about how societies work and how they protect privacy, and why and when they protect privacy. William Cudahy's The Fourth Amendment, Origins and Original Meaning, one of, actually I think is Neil Richards' favorite book. This is actually a really amazing piece of scholarship. I actually was writing a paper on the First and the Fourth Amendment, and I kept seeing cited this manuscript, this history, because there really wasn't much of a history of the Fourth Amendment. It's an intellectual history of the ideas that forged the Fourth Amendment, which in the United States is the amendment that regulates and guards against law enforcement information gathering. When government gathers information, when it engages in searches and seizures, that is protected by the Fourth Amendment. So it's a very important amendment. It's the major thing that regulates police conduct and generally government conduct and data gathering. So it's intellectual history. He traces this. The book is more than 1,000 pages long. So it's a very long manuscript, and it wasn't published. And so I was researching. I finally got a copy of the manuscript, which was, I wanted my own copy, so I had this 1,000-page, ridiculous. And I reached out to him. I said, why isn't this published? He said, I never really published it. No one wanted to publish a book this long, and I don't want to cut anything from it. So I actually put him in touch with a publisher, and they published it, which is great. And I got to write the preface, which was wonderful. Despite being this long, despite being 1,000 pages long, more than 1,000 pages, it's a great read. It's really interesting. There are a lot of really interesting anecdotes and stories and discussions of cases, and he really went through a lot of material and digested it. I definitely recommend this book. It's fascinating. It's daunting, but it's not. There's a lot of stuff in appendices and other things that give it its heft, but it actually is well worth a read, and I would strongly recommend it if you're interested in the intellectual origins of the Fourth Amendment, which are relevant everywhere. It's not just in the United States, but the ideas behind it are what this book is about. Profiling the European Citizen. This is a great collection of essays. These are really wonderful essays about profiling and how they work in how profiling works in EU law. Hildebrandt and Gutworth really, they wrote some of the essays in here, and they also curated a great group of essays. This book was published in 2008, but I think it has a lot of relevance even in the GDPR era. A lot of the ideas and discussions of the regulation of profiling are very relevant to the GDPR. So this book is still very relevant today, and I recommend it to understand how the GDPR regulates profiling and why. This is another book by me. It's very hard for me to resist. I did leave out some of my books, but I couldn't resist, so I put another one in. This is a book I wrote about how to conceptualize privacy. I wanted to pull together ideas on what privacy is, and I discussed a bit about the value of privacy here as well. The way I argued that privacy should be understood is not just as one thing. That was why there's such a struggle to understand privacy, is everyone wanted to reduce it to a common denominator. And I recommended using a Wittgensteinian family resemblance model to understand privacy, which is to see privacy as a bunch of related things, related by family resemblances. That it's a bunch of different things that are related to each other, but they don't all have the same common denominator. And we should stop trying to focus and have these endless debates on what privacy means and focus more on the specific things under the larger umbrella, because those are real problems, and they really do, they have similarities and differences. And if we understand the similarities and differences, we can make a lot of progress in how to tackle them. We can see, well, they're similar to this, then maybe we should treat them like this, but to a point. They're different, we should treat them differently. So if we really just zero in and explore the smaller cluster of different related things, we'll have much more progress than trying to focus in the clouds on some grandiose concept of privacy. This book, Delete, was a great early work on the right to be forgotten, and had a lot of influence on this. This is one of the first books that I remember reading about focusing on the right to delete. Since this book was published, we definitely saw a lot of activity on the right to be forgotten, the recognition in Google Spain of this right, and then the codification of the right by throwing it into the right to delete in the GDPR. Helen Nissenbaum's Privacy in Context. This is a really interesting book, a philosophical book on privacy. What she argues is that privacy should be understood as a form of, in a conceptual integrity theory, that privacy is contextual, and we need to understand it as such. I think it's actually there's a lot I like about this book, because I think she's right. Privacy is very much about context. I think that, I've seen a lot of attempts to use her theory of contextual integrity in ways that, are a little too loose, that what the thing is that you can make contextual integrity arguments about almost anything to get a lot of outcomes, whatever outcome you want. And so it's very easy to just put on the vestments of contextual integrity and kind of use it too much. I think that was not what Nissenbaum wanted in her book. I think she wanted to add rigor to context and not have it used in these kind of looser ways. But I think it has proven very valuable and important a book and a theory. And we still see a lot of discussions of privacy as contextual integrity. I just would hope that these approaches have a little bit more rigor, because I think that the rigor in her book is not matched by the rigor of a lot of the applications of this theory. Okay, so on we go to the 2010s, and we will start with this book series. You're probably familiar with it. I think these are books coming out of this conference, in fact. There are actually many books, actually starting, I think, even before 2010, but I think since the bulk of them are in 2010, I didn't know where to stick these books because they really cut across 3 decades, I believe. These are a great set of essays. Each book is focused on a particular topic. Every year there's a new volume, or even sometimes more than one a year, but there's a lot of them. And there's some really great essays in each one, so I definitely recommend them. I've tried to get my hands on as many as I can. Fortunately, some of them are published in paperback, but not all of them. So some of them actually you can get at a reasonable price, and then others are actually at an unreasonable price. I've tried to get my hands on as many as I can that are at least within the realm of affordability. But this is really a great book series, and it's incredibly helpful. I've found these essays to be wonderful. Anita Allen's Unpopular Privacy. Anita Allen, again, I talked about her book Uneasy Access before. She's actually written a number of other books. I like this one because it has a very interesting take on privacy. She argues that there are times when maybe we want to coerce privacy. Maybe we want to force people to accept privacy when they don't want privacy. And a lot of her work is less a kind of strong normative argument for one thing or other. A lot of it's kind of philosophical musings. So a lot what she does is kind of explore, just here's some really complicated questions and here's how we need to think about them. But she doesn't kind of come out with like, okay, here's the definitive answer or resolution to all the problems. But I think she raises some really interesting questions in this book and discusses some really interesting situations where giving people choices in privacy can actually, damage freedom. And generally, I think our view is, well, we want people to be free. We want people to be able to make their choices. But what if there are times when those choices are really harmful to themselves or to others? That could lead us to a situation where we might want to stop people from making certain choices. So I think it's a really interesting philosophical rumination on these questions. Okay, another book by me. I'm sorry. This is a book on the trade-off between privacy and security. It was a book that I wanted to elaborate on an essay I wrote called The Nothing to Hide Argument, which I thought was very flawed. And I talk a lot about various myths and faulty arguments about privacy and security, oftentimes arguments that would systematically skew the debate. Skew the debate between privacy and security and make it so that security would win out over privacy when it shouldn't. Okay, hopefully my voice isn't going out. That's back again. Okay. Julie Cohen's Configuring the Network Self. This is a really interesting philosophical discussion of digital technologies and the way that they're impacting freedom and expression and creativity. And I think that Julie has some of the best discussions of surveillance out there. I would say that the two people I think who've discussed surveillance and its impact on creativity and thought the best would be Julie Cohen and Neil Richards, who I think I'm going to talk about Neil's work too. But I think there's just really rich accounts of in this book of how surveillance inhibits people from thinking and how it shapes their thinking in ways that are controlled by others. Daniel Citron's Hate Crimes in Cyberspace. This book is a book about online harassment and the use of information about people to hurt them and harm them. And she talks a lot about disproportionately women are the targets of these harassment campaigns. She has vivid stories about these horrible campaigns against people, trying to drive especially women and minorities off the internet, threaten them, dox them, and what the law can do about it. And she talks about the importance of viewing using civil rights law to combat some of these harms. So it's a great book, and really great both in terms of the vividness, which she describes what's going on, and also the way that the law should deal with it. She has a great discussion also about free speech and how do we balance free speech against protections against this kind of harassment. Dragnet Nation, Julia Angwin, a reporter that came after O'Hara, a journalist who had a long-standing privacy beat, very much a successor to Robert O'Hara. In this book, she talks about the challenge for individuals who want to escape from the relentless surveillance that we're undergoing. And she shows how hard it is, the efforts, the Herculean efforts that it takes to kind of avoid the pervasive surveillance that we're in today. There's this book by Neil Richards, who spoke earlier at this event. He's back here. He's sitting back there waiting to see what I say about his book. The best book ever written, right? This is a great book. This is Neil's work on intellectual privacy. This is a term that Neil used to talk about the importance of privacy in protecting the constellation of values around expression, consumption of ideas, freedom of thought, very much the same set of values that underpin the First Amendment, which in the United States is the amendment that protects freedom of speech. And we often see in debates in the United States that free speech and First Amendment protections are pitted against privacy, that privacy clashes with the First Amendment, and that privacy is really has to be essentially sacrificed at the altar of the First Amendment. Now here in the EU, speech and privacy are kind of co-equal fundamental rights. In the United States, that's not the case. Privacy is not written in the Constitution. There's no constitutional right to privacy. There's been a right that's been inferred from and kind of read into the Constitution, but it doesn't have the same weight as the First Amendment, which explicitly protects privacy. So when you're dealing with a case involving privacy and free speech, the thumb is on the scale of free speech. And the First Amendment is often used as a cudgel to attack privacy law. And one thing that Richards does in this book is show that, in fact, privacy is not antithetical to these values, but in fact supports these values. In fact, is essential to these values. And we need to rethink the relationship between privacy and free speech and freedom of thought, because it's absolutely essential to these things. And so that's what this book does. Here's another book by Hildebrandt on smart technologies and the ends of the law. I think all of her work is incredibly thoughtful and philosophical. She really takes a very broad, holistic view of how technology works with personal data, how it impacts freedom, how it impacts other key social values. And I find her work incredibly sophisticated and also great to kind of show how everything is related to each other, how it's all interrelated, and how privacy affects so many different aspects of our life and society. This book by Bamberger and Mulligan is a book about the laws as written and then how the laws are implemented by companies. And they engaged in a lot of interviews for privacy officers and data protection officers to try to get what they thought about implementing the privacy laws they were complying with. And they reached some really interesting conclusions. One of the ones that really stuck out to me is that, and I totally agree with it, is that more ambiguous laws tend to actually lead to stronger compliance. That, even though companies beg, make the laws really clear and easy to follow, that the laws that were less clear tended to actually could be more effective. So I think there's a lot of other really interesting conclusions in this book, but it's definitely highly recommended. Frank Pasquale, Black Box Society is a terrific account of the importance of transparency. He talks a lot about all the use of algorithms in the background to make decisions about people's lives and how they were affecting people, but a lot of these algorithms were secret, and we really don't know what's going on. And I think this book is incredibly prescient for the world today. You could almost publish it today, and it would be like, oh, okay, it's 10 years later, and it's very much highly relevant today in the world of algorithms and AI, where we are lacking a lot of understanding and accountability. A lot of stuff is going on in secret, and it's not transparent or accountable. Bruce Schneier, Data and Goliath. This is a book about government surveillance and its harms, mass surveillance, and how the private sector facilitates government surveillance. It tells a very important story, and typical of Bruce Schneier, it is very wise and thoughtful in his policy analysis. He is a technologist by training. He's not a law professor or a political scientist, but I think his work is still very, very helpful on his policy suggestions. Everything he says is very thoughtful. This is a fascinating book by Jessica Lake, The Face That Launched 1,000 Lawsuits. And she talks about how a lot of cases involving women shaped privacy law, especially the common law of privacy in the United States. And she looks at the developments of photography, film, and other media, and how they shaped the development of the law. And there's a lot of interesting facts here that I didn't realize. And I think it's well worth a read. It's really interesting. Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction. This is a book about algorithms and very much AI, even though it's about big data, it's about very much AI and very relevant to AI debates today. She talks about a number of instances where algorithms are being used to make decisions in people's lives and the problems that they cause, how they're skewed, how they create harm, and how, unfortunately, policy often ignores the harm and overly worships the algorithms and does not question them sufficiently. Her training is as a technologist, so she writes from the technologist's perspective on the issues. Kara Bridges, the Poverty of Privacy Rights. This is I think it's a great companion book to the John Gilliam book that I discussed earlier. This book explores how poor people are subjected to a lot more surveillance than everybody else. And in particular, she has a very interesting discussion of why that might be the case. And she talks about how there are views about poor people that are viewing them as somehow immoral. And that because of this, they are deserving of extra surveillance. And so she talks about how these views have kind of found their way into policy and have influenced and justified the excessive surveillance that they're subject to. Here's a book by Joe Hartzog, who's also back there. This is Privacy's Blueprint. This is a book about privacy by design. It is a wonderful book about the ways in which designs of technologies, interfaces, and pretty much anything that's designed, how that shapes privacy. And he has a lot of great concrete examples, as well as incredibly important discussions for policy and recommendations for the law. The main thesis of the book is that you really design is political. Design is really key to regulating privacy. You can't really protect privacy and effectively regulate privacy without addressing design. It's too enmeshed in design, too intertwined in design to think that you can regulate privacy without addressing design. But policymakers are very afraid to get into and regulate design, which they have to get over that fear if we're going to have effective privacy regulation. Sarah Ego's The Known Citizen. This is a history of privacy in the United States. It has a lot of really interesting facts. It's a great read. It's really well written. It reads very quickly. It's not a short book, but it's an easy read, and there's a lot of fascinating details in that book. So I strongly recommend it if you want a good history of privacy. Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. This is a very famous book written in 2018. She coined the term surveillance capitalism, and the book is a very lengthy book. And it became a bestseller, which is shocking. I kind of just amazed. I want to ask her, what's your recipe? Here she comes out with a book. It's about 700 pages with gazillions of notes. And it's written in a fairly academic style, and yet it's a bestseller. And I'm like, how can you do that? I can't even get a book to sell like 100 copies. And my books are like a fraction of the length of your book. How can you sell like a 700-page book that you get so many people to buy? It's incredible, and it really did. It was at the right time, and it really captured the public discourse and had a very profound impact. And if you do a search for the term surveillance capitalism, you'll see just how widely it's used today. Julie Cohen's book, Between Truth and Power, is another great book by Julie Cohen. It's a very broad book looking at the pathologies of the information revolution and how we should combat them. This is a very dense book. It is not a book that you can. It's not a beach read. Let's put it that way. But it's a really great, thoughtful, philosophical account of the big picture. And she paints in a very, very big picture beyond just privacy, to really talk about the entire information ecosystem that we have today. Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, he is actually going to be my colleague. I'm really excited to say that he is joining the faculty of GW Law starting this fall. He is an expert on law enforcement and Fourth Amendment issues, and he's focused a lot on big data policing. This is the use of technology, surveillance technology, and data in law enforcement. And this is a great book on the topic. It is really essential for any discussion about this issue. I keep coming back to this book. Okay, let's bring us up to the present, and I'm going to go fast because we're getting tight on time. We will start with another book by Neil Richards, Why Privacy Matters. This is a great account of why privacy is valuable. Why should we care? And he talks about privacy myths. He talks about the importance of the value of privacy. He talks about what law should do to protect privacy. It's really all here. It is a wonderful book and actually a joy to read too. He writes very eloquently in the book and highly recommended. Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI. This book is a very thoughtful account of the physical and human dimensions to AI. We often think of AI as being about code and technology, but behind AI, there are people and resources. And she talks about all the resources that physical resources like water and space and other things that AI takes up, and the human labor that goes into AI, as well as its effects on people. So it's very interesting to how she weaves the physical and human world into AI in this book. Privacy is hard. This book goes through and is organized around various privacy myths, and myths that I think are ones that we see a lot today. Myths about that people have zero privacy and should just get over it. The nothing to hide myth. That there are only minimal privacy concerns with metadata, with certain just sort of basic pieces of data that we shouldn't be concerned about that, and other myths. And he walks through and talks about how these myths are wrong. I think it's a very thoughtful discussion. The Brussels effect by Anu Bradford. Professor Bradford coined the terms the Brussels effect for the influence of EU law around the world. And if I had to say what law is the most influential in privacy, it's the GDPR. It's EU data protection law is had the greatest influence worldwide. And she talks about why that is. Why is it that it's had this influence? Why is the Brussels effect occurring? And I think it's a very thoughtful discussion about why essentially the EU has won the debate on, they are the voice, the loudest, most influential voice on privacy and data protection. Ari Waldman's Industry Unbound. This book talks, it's a blistering critique of the certain aspects of privacy law that are the kind of compliance tasks that privacy law has. So privacy law will say, hey, do data protection impact assessments or privacy impact assessments. Do various documentation for justifying what the data is going to be used for. Have a privacy program and a privacy officer, and do various other documentation for what you're doing. And he argues that, I think very provocatively, that all this actually doesn't work, and that companies just do this in a rather perfunctory and non-serious way, and that a lot of this ends up being empty paper that then just justifies companies being able to do whatever they want. So they kind of just produce all this stuff, but that doesn't actually lead to better privacy protection. It's a very provocative argument. He spent a lot of time embedded in various companies, talking to their engineers, discussing things with various compliance officials at companies to learn what they were doing and to see how they understood privacy and how well they were doing these tasks. And he ultimately has really a blistering indictment of what goes on in companies and how weak their compliance actually is, how hollow it is. So it's a really eye-opening account of this. Danielle Citron's The Fight for Privacy. In this book, she talks about what she calls intimate privacy. This is privacy involving issues about the body, about personal relationships, about sex, about about health, about this kind of nexus of issues. And she talks about how important it is to protect this dimension of privacy. I see this as very much interesting to see it side by side with Neil Richards' intellectual privacy, because it's sort of another dimension of life. And Neil focuses on the kind of intellectual, creative thought. But privacy is also very important for health and relationships and how people that you love and people that you care about and your daily activities, all of which are involved in intimate privacy. And in typical Danielle Citron style, she has some really powerful, concrete stories about people whose lives were upended, and then as well a very thoughtful discussion about what the law should do about it and the speech implications and why privacy protection is consistent with protections of free speech, not antithetical to it. Amy Gajda's Seek and Hide is a book about the development of the right to privacy, which is not the right that you think of in terms of the GDPR. It's the right to privacy torts. It's basically the Warren and Brandeis privacy torts, the common law of privacy in the United States. She has some really interesting discussions that I didn't know about, things about like Samuel Warren, who was the other author, the other author of that piece. The main author that's most famous is Louis Brandeis, who became a Supreme Court justice. But there's also Samuel Warren, who co-authored the article with Brandeis, and his life is very interesting facts about why he got interested in privacy and what became of Samuel Warren. Digital Empires by Anu Bradford. This book explores this clash between three regimes for the future of digital technology regulation. The US market-based approach, the EU rights-based approach, and the Chinese state-driven approach. And she compares these different approaches, which are generalizations, and she talks about how each approach and why they are gaining traction or not gaining traction, how this tussle is occurring, why the GDPR and EU regulation has had a big influence around the world. And one interesting thing that I never thought of is, the regulation here is translated into all sorts of different languages. It's translated into more languages than almost any other country's regulation. So it's widely accessible and easy to get, whereas you often won't find the regulations in other languages. And so, the world can readily digest what comes out of Brussels and can then adopt it. And there are carrots to adopting it. If you adopt it, maybe you can get adequacy if you're really lucky and win the lottery. Because it's hard, but at least it's something. What do you get if you follow U.S. law? A headache, really. But you really don't get anything out of it. The Quantified Worker, Ifeoma Ajua. This is a book about how digital technologies are transforming the workplace, all the different surveillance and AI going on in the workplace. I think it's a really fascinating and great account of how the law is trying to digest all these changes in the workforce and in workforce privacy, and how it's often failing to fully address these issues. Kashmir Hills, Your Face Belongs to Us, is a terrific book about facial recognition technology. She interweaves two stories, and it's interesting. The one story is about her investigation of Clearview AI. You might have heard of it, this company that burst on the scene with this very powerful AI tool. They scrape billions of photos online, often illegally. They're getting in trouble every which way you look at, still somehow managing to survive. I think they should be shut down for all the violations they've done. But she chronicles her attempt to find out about this company, which was actually very hard to do because they were very secretive. And interspersed with that is the story of the development of facial recognition technology, how early attempts were often faulty and didn't work very well, and then ultimately how they succeeded and led to Clearview. And so the story of some of the harms, the warnings along the way, and that story interspersed with the rise of Clearview. It's a really interesting account. Okay. Ignacio Cafon's The Privacy Fallacy is a great synthesis of some of the thinking on privacy scholarship to date. He kind of goes through and takes a look at some of the debates and discourse of current privacy problems, things from harm and consent and other things in a very thoughtful way. AI snake oil. This book is written by two computer scientists in particular, Arvind Narayanan, who is really famous and has done a lot of really famous studies and produced some really famous works in this area. And he provides a very good dose of skepticism about some of the overblown claims of AI, discussions of the harms of AI. And one of the things that I particularly like is that he has this very powerful discussion about how predictive AI doesn't work and can never work. And this is something that I wrote, co-authored an article with Yuki Matsumi, who is here in Brussels, actually, at Frye University. And he, his work and our work together also makes a claim about the problems and real damage and harms caused by predictive AI technology. And I think this book also talks about that as well as other types of AI. The AI is not one thing, many different things. So this book on the ethics of privacy and surveillance is a very thoughtful philosophical account of the public-private distinction, about surveillance generally, about the meaning and value of privacy. It's a great philosophical book that I strongly recommend. The Ordinal Society is by two authors who have written a number of very influential articles in sociology, and this sociological account of privacy looks at it from the standpoint of the dangers of ranking and measurement, that, you know, when you put things into algorithmic form, you're kind of ranking and measuring things in certain ways, and that has skewing effects. And they talk about skewing and bias and some of the distorting and problematic effects when it comes to moving it more in this direction, trying to turn everything into something that algorithms can address. It skews the world. Guardrails. This book is an interesting discussion of a kind of middle ground when it comes to privacy protection. The idea that we should, have a zone where there's a little bit of freedom to play, but there needs to be guardrails, kind of like a sandbox, and we need a box around it so that you can't cross the guardrails. I see this book to some extent is similar to a book called Nudge, and it's a book that was written by Thaler and Sunstein a number of years ago, where it talks about a middle ground where the law can kind of nudge things. I see this book as much of a bit of a middle ground book, how we can have privacy regulation that has some guardrails but some freedom. And I think that there are times when we do want a law that kind of is a kind of middle ground position like this. I think there are other times where we might want a law that is a little bit harder, maybe stricter, that just says no. Which would be very nice. But I do think, yes, you can't always say no. You need a system where there is some freedom to play a little bit for the tech companies. The question is just how big a sandbox do you give them? And where should the guardrails be? And finally, my book, I'll just end with that, my most recent book, which I talked about before, so I don't really want to say anything more about it. And we're going to see more books coming out this year, so there's more to come. But that's pretty much the last number of years in privacy books. Thank you for enduring this long historical journey. I hope that you found some interesting books that you want to read.
You can find some of the books from the list at the bookstand downstairs. We will see you after lunch for Damian Clifford, Data Protection Law and Emotion. Thank you.